Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. Earlier this year, I interviewed Ryan Brady from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources about snowy owls. That episode was so popular, I thought I'd reprise the topic for this week's show. I talked with David Brinker from Project SNOWstorm, a citizen-sponsored research project to study the enigmatic owl. Project SNOWstorm began in late 2013 during a large invasion of snowy owls from the Arctic into the lower 48 states. The project aims to learn more about the owl's movements and ecology via tracking data. Project SNOWstorm recently added 2 trackers to snowy owls in Wisconsin. I asked Brinker, who's an ecologist with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, but a native Wisconsinite, to talk about that effort which he participated in. Tell me how Project SNOWstorm started. Like, how did this all come together?
Project SNOWstorm started 5 years ago now, when there was another one of these very large eruptions that comes down in the lower 48 states. And that one was real big in the east. We got a bug in our bonnets to see what we could do to learn about what snowy owls do in the wintertime when they're down here with us in the middle latitudes, and called a friend of mine, and we started talking about ways of using some existing collaborative work that we do with different owl species, solid owls. Very quickly put together an effort to learn more about snowy owls in the wintertime and try and improve what we do from a conservation standpoint. We threw that project together very quickly. From the early December till about the 1st of January, and our web presence and everything else went live January 1, 2014. So we're now 5 years into it, and Project SNOWstorm is the largest snowy owl telemetry project in the world, and exciting people about snowy owls. We're collecting a considerable amount of data and moving forward with better descriptions of what they do down here, so we can think about how to provide conservation impact down in the lower 48.
So what was the need at the time? Why was this necessary that you banded together on this project?
Well, really what we know about snowy owls is fairly small. I mean, the people have been going to the Arctic to study them for a long time, and we have some pretty good handles on their breeding biology up in the Arctic. But when they come down here, people always thought, geez, they're cool. There's a few individuals that have done a fair amount of banding, but you put a band on a bird, and if the bird moves around a lot, about all you can learn is, well, okay, it was recovered 4 years later here dead, and you know roughly how long it lived, but you don't get a good idea of how they use habitat and things like that. And what we were interested in doing was putting telemetry on them so we could figure out, okay, how much space does a snowy owl need in the wintertime? Does that need for space vary by habitat? How do they use the habitats? There were theories, and people had, suggested ideas like, well, they go out on the ice and things like that. But nobody could really prove that. When they leave a Great Lakes shoreline and disappear, you would notice that this usually happened when the ice formed on, say, Lake Erie. And it's like, well, why did they all disappear? And people say, well, they go out on the ice. Well, you couldn't prove it. Nobody's out there. It's not really very safe to go out in the middle of Lake Erie before the ice is fast and thick and see how many snowy owls are just sitting out on the ice. And so once we put transmitters on them, we started getting data that answers those questions, sort of verifies those theories that people had. Snowy owls do a lot of their living in coastal environments, along the Great Lakes shorelines, along the Atlantic coast. And one of the things that telemetry allowed us to do was look at their movements and find things like, yeah, they go out and ride ice floes in the middle of Lake Erie, feeding on waterfowl that are living in the spaces in between the chunks of ice that are floating around out there. And some of the owls that are coastal here on the Atlantic coast end up with pretty large ranges and move around a lot. Whereas you go to inland owls that are sitting there in grassland systems, farm fields, things like that, many of those owls have pretty tight little winter use areas. They will move around a lot until they find a spot with good prey densities, and they have some way of evaluating the prey density, and they get to a point where, yeah, it looks like I can make it through the winter here, and then they settle down and become homebodies until it's time to go back north to the Arctic.
You've been doing the project for about 5 years now. Has it been a success from your standpoint, and what's left to do? What do you hope to continue to do with the project?
We consider it highly successful, and it depends on how you measure success. But this is a crowd-funded effort, and we've taken the charisma that is a snowy owl, that it gets people excited, and use that to develop this effort. We just put our 60-second transmitter on a snowy owl last night. And there's still a fair number of questions out there that we want to look at. Things like when you have snowy owls in close proximity to each other, how do they divvy up the space? You know, what we've done so far tends to have owls marked over a large landscape from as far west as North Dakota to Maine, down here to Maryland. And you can spread this sample of 62 owls out, and you get an idea how they use all these different habitats. But we haven't had too many cases where owls are in close proximity, so you can look at the real nitty-gritty of how 2 or 3 or 5 owls will divvy up a chunk of habitat, whether it be along a coast or in an upland area. That's one thing we're looking at. There are other things that until we did this, there weren't good answers for, like how high does a snowy owl fly when it migrates? If it does something like go up to 1,000 feet and then take off and head for the Arctic, the benefit of a behavior like that is you get up above a lot of cultural things that people put in their way that can cause collisions. You get out of the way of power lines, you get out of the way of turbines and stuff like that. Well, we didn't know how high they flew when they migrated, but our transmitters are sensitive enough that we can sit there, and they're taking GPS points, and they give us latitude and longitude, and they also give us elevation. So this is one of the first times when anybody could sit there and say, yeah, we can now document how high snowy owls fly when they're migrating. And the results there are pretty important to conservation because they don't go up to 1,000 feet. They're generally relatively close to the ground and at elevations that put them at risk for turbine strikes. And that's not to say that wind energy is something that's bad. It's a piece of information that helps you better plan how you locate things like wind turbines. And if you have a place that you know is highly used by snowy owls, you might either locate turbines elsewhere or change the way you locate turbines in a place that has a lot of snowy owl use. So we look at things like that. There's something as far as, even though there's a lot of people who have done work on the birds in the Arctic, we don't understand the juvenile mortality rate very well or the dispersal very well. So one of the next things we're going to do is put similar sensitive transmitters on young birds to look at dispersal away from nest sites and see how widely they disperse, how much interchange there is in between areas or subpopulations. In some ways, snowy owls are thought to do a lot of wandering in the Arctic and not be very fidelic to going back to the same place to nest, and that's because their prey source is very variable. It's cyclical. And so understanding how young birds disperse would add to what we know about their behavior so that we can think better about how to keep snowy owls at a sustainable population level.
Is that one of the big concerns of the project, is kind of making sure that when they're down in the States, in our area, that they're taken care of and they're watched out for, and they're not being killed by what man-made objects or cars or whatever it may be.
There's only a certain amount of things that we can modify so that we can improve their conditions down here. We can't necessarily change the way we run our highways and that. And when snowy owls get down in the 48, they're susceptible to a lot of different things. But you can do things like we had one of our snowy owls recently get killed as an auto collision on a very busy road that goes right through really good habitat. And that's the kind of thing where if a local jurisdiction wanted to implement a act locally, think globally type action, they could say, well, we don't need to go 55 miles or an hour across this piece of salt marsh that we know owls are hunting regularly. We could slow it down to 35 and give the owls a break because they're down in these marshes oftentimes in the wintertime. You can do things like one of the things we'd like to get a better handle on is, are there any real pathways or concentration areas? And if you can start to identify concentration areas, your conservation impact can be that you might better plan wind energy deployments nearby. Wind turbines offshore are maybe better places to site them as long as they're not in waterfall concentration areas. One of the things we've learned about snowy owl behavior is when they're coastal, they're foraging on a lot of our wintering waterfowl. And if you have a area that's a high concentration for winter waterfowl, you don't want to put a turbine there for the waterfowl, nor for the snowy owls that are going to feed on the waterfowl.
So I know Project SNOWstorm was recently in Wisconsin putting some trackers on some birds. Could you tell me a little bit about what the project was up to in Wisconsin recently?
Wisconsin's been an important state for us because the people that know how to put our GPS, GSM trackers on birds are relatively few and far between. And Wisconsin has a long history of research and interest in snowy owls going way back into the 60s when folks like the Hammerstroms and other raptor people worked on snowy owls for quite a while. When we started Project SNOWstorm, we looked for a couple colleagues in Wisconsin to help. And so during the first big eruption in 2013-14, we put a number of our radios on snowy owls then. And then a few more on, we were trying again to get owls that were close together. And we've got a pair of owls near the Buena Vista Marsh area, south of Stevens Point in the east of Wisconsin Rapids. Those two owls are behaving nicely, and you can watch them interact with each other and how they're carving up space. And we initially wanted to try and get 4 or 5 transmitters on very close proximity in the lower Green Bay area. But the cold weather of December sort of threw us a quick curveball and froze up the bay before we could get all the transmitters on owls there. So we're saving that idea for a future years. Get back there, get prepared, get a number of owls that when they come down, they focus on lake shores and things like that. And Lower Green Bay is a really good place to see them. Try and get, say, 4 or 5 transmitters on birds in close proximity. And then we know what will happen. We know that eventually the lower bay will freeze and the owls will disperse, and it'd be worthwhile to see how they handle this dispersal. How far do they go once the bay freezes up? Things like that. We work with people at airports to get snowy owls safely trapped and relocated away from airports, both for the benefit of the owl and the benefit of the flying public. I mean, you don't want a jet ingesting a snowy owl and causing a serious incident. So we put our telemetry on owls that get moved away from airports periodically to see how effective that is. Do the birds just turn around and go right back to an airport, or do they settle down and stick? And one of the things we've learned by doing this is that there's really 2 things you got to pay attention to. You got to get them a good distance away, and you got to try and put them in habitat that's got good prey densities. And if you do that, it's usually a very effective way of reducing the risk to the traveling public by moving the snowy owl. If you don't go far enough, they tend to come back. If you put them in habitat that doesn't have a good food resource, they start wandering around, and if they wander too widely, they can either re-encounter the airport they were moved away from or find another airport, and they're just then back to being a nuisance at an airfield. So the Wisconsin connection, we've got a transmitter on a bird that was relocated away from Austin Straubel Airport in Green Bay, and it's now over in Buena Vista, and it's sticking real nice. So
you mentioned it's a difficult thing to track down these birds and catch them. Can you tell me a little bit about the process of doing that? How do you find them, and then how do you trap them, basically?
Finding them is just a matter of being out in the field and looking. It's relatively easy if you know what to look for. The snowy owls will tend to be down low, out of the wind during the daytime. They are owls. They do rest during the daytime, even though you occasionally see them out foraging. But once you get towards dusk, they come up, they get up on perches where they can survey the landscape. Over time, people have figured out good places where you can find snowy owls. And you can go to something like eBird and see where the bird watchers are finding them and find, okay, here's a concentration. Owls are being seen here frequently. And what we end up doing is the people that are working with us, you go out there with a variety of traps. You put bait like a starling or a pigeon in a cage that has nooses on it, and when the snowy owl comes down to try and get the bait, which it can't hurt in the cage, it walks around and gets its foot caught in a noose, and then you have your snowy owl. Now, all this work is permitted. You need to have permits from the bird banding lab, which is part of the USGS, and you need state permits. So it's not like anybody can willy-nilly go out and do this. They're trained people. They're people that have gone through and done this with other individuals to learn how to do it. And it's all done relatively safely for the owls and the bait as well. You don't want to injure your bait because that's inhumane. So the other thing we might do is we sometimes use an automated bow net where you put your bait in a cage in the center of the bow net, and when the owl comes down to try and get the bait, you have a radio-controlled release, and you just push it, and the bow net flips over the owl, and you can catch it that way. So those are two of the more common techniques.
And when you capture one, what's the process after that? Do you do some like tests on them, like health tests, in addition to the tracker?
Once an owl is captured, it's a fairly standard process to evaluate the owl. We have guidelines where you look at how much muscle mass they have on their breast. You weigh them. We take some measurements on them, like their wing length and their tail length. We only put trackers on birds that are in good health and large enough to carry the additional weight of the transmitter, and it's not a large weight. It's 3 to 3.5% of their body weight and max. And a lot of the owls that we put transmitters on, the weight is even below the 3% guideline. So owls that are in really poor condition that are moved away from airports usually go to a rehabber to get bulked up. Most owls that banders deal with, they take a different approach where they're capturing a creature in the wild, they're studying its ecology, they'll weigh it, measure it, evaluate it, and release it, and even release the ones that are in less than the best condition to see how those birds do. And oftentimes, if they get in a good place with adequate prey, they'll add weight to them and get through the winter. And if not, sometimes they do perish. But that's part of learning what the mortality factors is and how long they live. And so some of them do have to tough it out and see how they do.
So what's it like to be up close with these animals, to have them in your hands, basically, and just kind of be really up close to them? Because I think that's an experience that, not a lot of people will have an opportunity to have. So, I mean, just what's it like to be in the presence of these birds up close?
snowy owls ooze charisma. So to have one in your hand is one of those wildlife experiences that you kind of remember for your life. And that kind of interaction between a researcher and a study animal is what keeps a lot of us going. It's why we sit there when it's 10 and 15 below trying to go out and catch a snowy owl and learn more about its ecology. They're just such marvelous animals. They look back at you with big yellow eyes, and there's a connection there that's kind of hard to describe. But the energy we get from being able to interact that way with an animal and then follow its travels as it spends its winter in, say, central Wisconsin and then goes back north. That's what motivates us to do it. It's that unique connection that you get that once you've seen one up close or had the opportunity to work with them, you're hooked on this kind of thing for the rest of your life.
So it's a thrill every time, basically.
It never gets old.
Can you tell me about the first time you saw a snowy owl in the wild?
It was a long time ago. Almost hard to remember when the first one was, but it would have been almost assuredly while I was an undergraduate student at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, because Green Bay annually has snowy owls down in the lower Bay area. And when you spend 4 years there and you're out in the field and bird watching, sooner or later you see one. And I can't remember seeing one any earlier than that. I might have as a youth, but it would have been pretty rare because they don't really get to southeast Wisconsin very often. So I suspect I was a freshman, sophomore in college and was out birding, and that's when I saw my first snowy in the Green Bay area.
Another question about handling these birds. Do they put up a fight? I mean, are they pretty docile, or how is it like when you're trying to put the tracker on them? Are they agitated? Are they putting up a fight? What's kind of that experience like?
They're individuals. Some of them will be feistier than others. They all don't want to be handled. They would prefer that they weren't trapped, and so that we minimize the time we spend handling them to keep the stress down and get them processed as quickly as possible. But their real tools, their way of defending themselves, are their gigantic feet and talons. And when you're holding one and you have a good hold of the feet, you basically control it. Some owls will just sort of, once they realize that, no, I'm not going to be able to fly away, they sit there and they look at you, and can be fairly docile and easy to put a transmitter on. And then you get another individual that just wants no part of it and makes it as difficult as they can for you to fit it with a transmitter, to weigh it and measure it and do all the other things. And it will be trying to nip at you with its bill and bite. They're not as aggressive a biter as some birds, but some of them do bite. Some of them just sit there and look back at you and say, okay, get over with it so you can let me go. And of course, they all probably feel rather good when you finally let them go and they fly away. One of the things that people often think is that when you're doing something like this, you trap an owl and put a transmitter on it, that it's going to leave its local haunt and they'll never see it again. And in our experience, that's relatively rare. We often trap these owls. We put the transmitters on, you go back and you release them at the point of capture if it's not an airport or something like that. And they go right back to their old haunts, sitting on the same old telephone poles, on the same old building roofs and things like that. And it's almost like it was a very short side trip that doesn't make much difference to them. As soon as you let them go, they're back to normal.
I know when you put a tracker on these birds, you give them kind of a name. I assume for kind of like the public's, to help the public kind of, relate to these birds or track these birds and feel associated with them. How do you come up with the names that you come up with, and what's kind of the rationale for wanting to name a bird?
The real reason for giving them names is I think just about anybody can keep track of something in your mind much easier if you have a name to it. We could play the standoff science game of being objective and just say, well, this is owl number 1 and this is owl number 2. And, those numbers sort of run together pretty quickly. And by the time you get to the point of 60-some owls, it's like, owl number 43. Which one was that? Where was it? So what we chose to do is give them names that are based on geographic areas close to where they were trapped. That gives people a handle. Sometimes the names seem like human names, and we've avoided human names because we're trying to dance that little bit of a fence line where the name is useful. It helps us relate to the bird and where it is, but we don't want people to get so attached to an owl that when bad things happen, and they occasionally do, that then, there's all this angst that, oh, poor Sammy died. He got hit by a train or something like that. So if you look at our names, they usually reflect a geographic area. The owl that we relocated from Austin Straubel Airport got the name Austin, and even though that sounds human, its derivation is from the airport. And we had one owl in the first year that was moved away from an airport and taken up near Freedom, Wisconsin, and that owl was named Freedom. So that's really our rationale, is geographic places. The newest owl that we did was down here in coastal Maryland, and that bird has been named Cinnapuxent because it's going to go out and forage on Cinnapuxent Bay behind Assateague Island, is what I expect it to do. And we've got a couple other owls that have been named for Assateague, and we needed something that was close, and so it ended up being the bay behind the island.
Is there a fan favorite of the owls, or maybe one of your favorites that you've enjoyed tracking?
I don't know overall what the most favorite owl would be for all the people that have watched this. The first year, there was an owl that was relocated away from the Philadelphia airport that was named Philly. And out here in the east, that was a very favorite owl. And unfortunately, Philly made some bad decisions, and he went back to the airport and met his maker with a cargo plane. And so, people really kind of mourned Philly. And we had another one here that is local favorite in the New Jersey area that was named Higbee. That was bird watchers there were just, watching this owl all the time. And we had a winter storm in early January, and the bird got hit by a car. And so, everybody was commenting about Higbee. But I think the one that is my favorite and has been the most fun was an owl named Baltimore that we put a band on during the 2013-2014 eruption when it was moved away from a local airport in Baltimore. By that time, it was late in the season, and we'd marked quite a few males, and he was marginal weight-wise, so it's like, no, we're not going to put a tracker on him. We took him away from the airport and released him. Well, a year later, he was retrapped at the same airport, about the same weight, a little bit heavier, but he was a year older at that point, so we knew he was an experienced owl that had made it through the juvenile mortality bottleneck that happens with a lot of wildlife. That first year is really tough. So we put a transmitter on that owl, and he went back to the Arctic. He came back the next winter to Amherst Island in eastern Canada, went back to the Arctic again, and came back down to an area near Amherst Island for another winter. And so we just got wonderful tracks on him. And the folks from National Public Radio have been working with us with a little bit of broadcasting things and helping get the word out. And they did a video piece that you can go online to YouTube and find the story of Baltimore and how he went north that first year, where when it went north, it went right over the center of New York City. And then went to Amherst Island, and then went up to the Arctic. And there is a very wonderful little piece there on YouTube that folks can watch. And so Baltimore's kind of my favorite because it was one of my birds, and he's performed just wonderfully.
Are you ever surprised by like the response that these birds get from the public? It just seems like there's always a lot of interest in seeing these birds, hearing about these birds, learning about these birds. Are you ever surprised by that?
The public's reaction to snowy owls doesn't really surprise me because I've seen it going on for years and years. People relate well to owls because when you look at your standard bird, think of a robin and look it straight in the beak. And you're going to see the bird's bill and its forehead and its eyes kind of sticking out on the left and right side, but you're not really looking into it. Sociologists and anthropologists think that the connection between people and owls has to do with the fact that owls have more binocular vision than just about any other bird group, so that when you look at an owl, you're looking back at a face. You see two eyes, and the bill will, in a lot of people's mind, mimic a nose, and owls have facial discs that give them a very round head similar to babies, and so there's some primal attraction. And when you then have this great big white owl that, when you look at it, looks back at you, it grabs your soul. And it works whether you're a wildlife fanatic or you're just a Harry Potter fan. People just really seem to relate to snowy owls. And that's what's made Project SNOWstorm work. I mean, we're crowdfunded. We're getting to the point where by the end of this winter, people that are interested in what we're doing, interested in conservation, interested in wildlife, interested in snowy owls, have stepped up to the tune of $250,000. And we don't get money from grants. We don't write research proposals. This is people that are being energized by our ability to connect to them via the internet and the web and get our message out there. And what I think really captivates people is being able to say, I'm going to follow this owl because it's in my backyard. Folks in northeast Wisconsin can follow Austin and Bancroft, and the folks from Madison Audubon can sit there and follow Arlington. And the Wisconsin connection that has been really nice is in the state of Wisconsin 2 times now. The first in eruption 5 years ago, and then again this year, have stepped up to help us do this by sponsoring owls, to basically paying for the cost of the transmitter and the data access time to make this project happen. And then we take all the data that we collect here and start writing research papers that get published in peer-reviewed journals, and then improve our understanding of snowy owls' behavior in the wintertime. Things like that. We recently got a PhD student who's going to take all of our data, and we're to the point now where that $250,000 that we've raised via crowdfunding has resulted in better than 250,000 GPS points for where snowy owls were in time and space. And she's going to do her dissertation on snowy owl behavior and movements based on all the data that we've accumulated. And that's what we thought of when we started Project SNOWstorm, is take advantage of the big eruption, get people to work together and collaborate, gather the data in a well-defensible way, and make it available to others to analyze and come up with answers to conservation questions.
How did you first get into kind of this line of work, this line of study? What drew you to this?
I've been a kid that was interested in everything living from like day one. Back in childhood in Racine, I would go out to the railroad tracks and catch butterflies, or go out to the local puddle and catch snakes and frogs and tadpoles. And nature fascinated me, and it just one growth to another. It leads you to a college career, and you become a wildlife ecologist, and then you'll get a job, and it's been constant. It's been a part of my life from day one. And I don't know if any one thing led me to it, but there's something about nature that inspires me and hopefully inspires a lot of other people. And that's why we do the things we do, trying to take good care of the world so that our children and grandchildren can have experiences similar to what we had.
So you grew up in Wisconsin. How did you find yourself in Maryland? What took you there?
Wildlife jobs are few and far between. And when I was at that stage of life where, I was really developing my career, I'd been working for an environmental consulting firm and did really fun things and were making, pretty reasonable salary and doing well, but I was not as connected to wildlife as I had really hoped I'd be. And so I started looking for alternatives and went to the University of Maryland to work on a graduate degree, and then ended up working for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources in what's been, almost a perfect job for me, where I work with rare, threatened, and endangered species, primarily birds, throughout the state of Maryland. And it's been one of the, just a terrific career to get into. And once I got out here and got doing that, even though I'd like to go back to Wisconsin, I got a dream job, and so it's kept me here.
But it's nice to get home sometimes and go searching for owls around Wisconsin parts as well.
I have a lot of family still in Wisconsin. I have 6 cousins that are hunters and fishermen from day one, and we always used to spend time in the woods. So as often as I can, we go home to visit. My brother's still in Neenah. I got my Wisconsin roots. Hunting and fishing here on the East Coast isn't like hunting and fishing in northern Wisconsin. So to get my fixes on northern lakes and things like that, anytime I get a chance, I come back. And something like this year's snowy owl eruption was like, yeah, maybe it's time to get back to Wisconsin, do a little bit of work on snowies, visit relatives. And that was a big part of making the snowy owl effort in Wisconsin happen this year.
For people who want to get involved or learn about the project, how can they get involved? How can they contribute? Since it's a kind of a citizen science venture, how do people participate and help out?
The biggest way that people have participated is, the financial support. We wouldn't be able to do what we've done without all the donations, from $5 donations from school kids to more substantial ones. It's certainly the easiest thing to say. That's how people get involved. But there's other ways. People can go out and, if they're bird watchers, find snowy owls and enter their data in eBird, because eBird will be a way that, folks can look at distribution of snowy owls in one of these big eruption events. If they find snowy owl has died, whether it be a highway collision or just walking out in the field, and here's one, you can collect it, get it to your state natural resource agency, get it to the DNR, and then we have a group of veterinarians that will sit there and we necropsy all the snowy owls that are turned in that make it into our system to learn about what are the mortality causes. Trauma via collision is a big one, probably more so than birds starving to death. We also gives us an opportunity to sample the bird's tissues and look for things like, is mercury contamination an issue, or are the birds in urban areas, like say if there was a snowy owl in downtown Milwaukee or downtown Green Bay, getting contaminated with rodenticides that are put out to control rats and mice. And then the other thing is, nowadays with digital cameras and that, people take photos of snowies. And when you get a good photo of a spread wing and a spread tail and do it without harassing the owl, if the owl just happens to fly by, or you're watching it and a bald eagle comes by and flushes it, and so you get an opportunity to take a photo with an open wing and tail. From those photos, digital images are now good enough that we can determine what sex the bird is and oftentimes what age the bird is. And we have a way of collecting those and putting them in a database where then interns or students can sit there and do something like we had one of them do, where they wrote a paper on the distribution of the different age and sex class in the first eruption, just by all the photos that people contributed to Project SNOWstorm's website. So that's another way that they can get involved. And probably the most important way is climate change is real. Climate change is happening. And we can stay away from the argument about, is it human-induced or not? That's where it always gets contentious. But the science is clear that our Earth is warming. And so people can think about their lifestyles and see if they're making good decisions to help mitigate this or slow it down. Because if we don't deal with climate change, it's going to impact us personally here in the middle latitudes. But where you're going to see the biggest impact is in the Arctic, on things like polar bears and snowy owls and Arctic hares and gyrfalcons and things like that. So oftentimes when I give a public presentation, the conservation message at the end, you won't be able to go to the Arctic. That's expensive. Very few of us ever get to do that. But we can do good things for all the creatures that live in the Arctic by trying to live with as green a footprint as we can.
It really sounds like if, snowy owls were harmed by climate change and you wouldn't see them around, that would kind of break your heart a little bit, wouldn't it?
It would be a massive heartbreak. And people keep saying, why are these big eruptions occurring? 5 years ago, we were talking about, we'll probably never see one of this size again in our life. And here we are 4 years later with a relatively large eruption. While on the face, that might look good, and people say, well, there's lots of them around. That could potentially be a reflection of some climate change signals, where if you're getting more snow in the Arctic, you allow lemming populations to build up, and then and because you have lots of lemmings, you have lots of snowy owl babies, and that's why we get these big eruptions. Well, as climate change continues, when that snow starts to not happen because the Arctic's getting warmer and warmer, or when that snow starts to get iced over more frequently so the lemmings can't get out of the snow and get up in the air when they occasionally need to leave the safety and cover of the snow. Or the Arctic, instead of getting snow, gets ice storms like we get down here. That takes away food, and that could change the lemming cycles. And folks in Europe, particularly Norway and that, are seeing that they used to have snowy owl cycles like we see here in North America. And those snowy owl cycles have disappeared. And the folks that are working in the Arctic in that part of the world are attributing that to climate change impacts. Their snowpack is not what it used to be. The lemming cycles have disappeared. Lemmings are still there, but they don't go through these massive booms. And then because you don't have massive booms of lemmings, the snowy owls are not doing as well as they were. So while things might look a little better now, I'm kind of concerned because big eruptions like this generally don't happen every 4 years. You get eruptions, but not massive ones like we've been seeing. And only time will tell. And if it goes so that my children and grandchildren don't see snowy owls as often because their populations have declined as a result of climate change, I think the world's going to be a poorer place. All the people that like snowy owls won't get that opportunity anymore.
Thank you to David for taking some time to talk about his passion project. You should definitely check out the project's website, where you can follow the owls that the project has put trackers on. Thanks for listening. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. If you're liking the show, please rate or review the show on your podcast service. It goes a long way in helping new listeners find the show. You can also stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter at WISPodcast and on Facebook at the Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.